September 15th, 1945. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp White in southern Oregon, where rows of white barracks stretched toward the Cascade Mountains. Behind the wire fences, 3,200 Japanese prisoners of war stood in formation, awaiting the announcement everyone knew was coming. The war had ended 31 days ago. Home was calling. Yet when the commanding officer stepped forward to explain the repatriation process, something unexpected rippled through the ranks. Not relief, but uncertainty. Some men exchanged worried glances, others stared at the ground, their expressions unreadable. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened next would challenge everything both captors and captives believed about loyalty, identity, and what it means to belong somewhere. In the coming weeks, nearly 2/3 of the men in that camp would make a choice that shocked military officials, bewildered the American public, and revealed a transformation so profound it would be studied by sociologists for generations. The story began 3 years earlier, when the first transport ships arrived at West Coast ports, carrying captured soldiers from Pacific Island campaigns. These were men who had been taught that surrender meant eternal shame, that capture was worse than death itself. Military psychologists had warned camp administrators to expect suicide attempts, escape plots, and violent resistance. Instead, they found something far more complex. Lieutenant Colonel Howard Brubaker had overseen Camp White since its conversion to a prisoner facility in 1943. A career officer from Iowa, with 22 years of service, Brubaker approached his assignment with methodical practicality. He read the intelligence briefs about fanatical devotion and warrior codes, but he also understood that hungry, exhausted men were still men. His first directive surprised his staff. Treat the prisoners with strict fairness according to Geneva Convention standards, but also with basic human dignity. The camp occupied 400 acres of scrubland and pine forest. Prisoners lived in tar paper barracks, heated by wood stoves, 60 men to a building. The perimeter fence stood 12 feet high, topped with barbed wire, though guards noted early on that escape attempts were remarkably rare. What purpose would fleeing serve? Beyond the fence lay a country at war with their homeland, speaking a language most didn't understand. Among the first arrivals was Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, a 32-year-old veteran of campaigns in China and the Philippines. Captured on Saipan after his unit was overrun, Yamamoto had spent the ship voyage expecting execution or, at best, brutal imprisonment. His father had been a soldier in an earlier conflict, and the old man's stories emphasized that enemies showed no mercy. The reality of Camp White struck Yamamoto immediately upon arrival. Guards processed the prisoners efficiently, but without cruelty. Medical staff treated wounds and illnesses. Each man received a wool blanket, eating utensils, and a bar of soap. The camp commander addressed them through an interpreter, explaining the rules clearly. Obey regulations. Work assignments would be optional but paid. Red Cross packages would be distributed, and letters to family in Japan would be permitted once monthly. That first night, Yamamoto lay awake on his bunk, listening to whispered conversations throughout the barracks. Many men were weeping, some from relief at being alive, others from shame at having surrendered. 23-year-old Private Hiroshi Tanaka, who slept 3 bunks away, had tried to take his own life on the transport ship by refusing food for 9 days. The ship's doctor had force-fed him through a tube, saving a life Tanaka no longer wanted. The work program started in November of 1943. Prisoners could volunteer for agricultural labor in the surrounding valley, helping local farms with harvest work. The pay was 80 cents per day in camp scrip, usable at the canteen for cigarettes, candy, writing paper, and other small items. Of the 3,200 men in camp, 2,400 volunteered. This decision itself represented a profound shift. In military culture back home, cooperation with captors was considered collaboration. But here, isolated from their homeland and its judgments, different calculations emerged. The work was honest labor, not weapons production. The pay allowed small dignities, and the farms needed help desperately. James Sullivan ran a 300-acre apple orchard 5 miles from Camp White. a third-generation farmer in his 50s. Sullivan had lost his two sons to the Pacific War, one serving with the Marines, the other in the Navy. When Camp White officials approached him about using prisoner labor, Sullivan's first instinct was refusal. These were the enemy. These men wore the same uniform as those his boys were fighting. His wife Martha changed his mind with a simple observation. "The fruit is rotting, Jim. We can hate them and lose the farm, or we can let them work and feed people. The apples don't care about the politics." The first morning, 12 Japanese prisoners arrived at Sullivan's orchard, transported in an army truck with 2 guards. Yamamoto was among them, assigned as crew leader due to his agricultural background. His family had farmed rice in Niigata Prefecture for 7 generations. Sullivan greeted them with a curt nod and gestures toward the trees heavy with unpicked red delicious apples. The work proceeded in silence initially. Sullivan watched from a distance, noting their efficiency. They handled the fruit carefully, sorted it properly, and worked steadily without the supervision he'd expected to provide. By the lunch break, they'd picked more than his regular crew usually managed in a full day. Sullivan's wife brought out lunch, sandwiches and thermoses of coffee. The prisoners hesitated, uncertain whether this was permitted. Through broken English and hand gestures, Martha made clear they were to eat. One prisoner, a young man named Kenji Sato, who had studied some English in school, worked up courage to speak. "Thank you, ma'am, very kind." Martha nodded, then surprised everyone by returning to the house and bringing out a tray of fresh-baked cookies. "You're working hard," she said simply. "You should eat well." That small gesture rippled through the men. Several bowed deeply. Yamamoto felt something crack inside his chest, some barrier he'd been holding since capture. This simple farmer's wife, whose sons fought against Japan, had baked them cookies. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. Over subsequent weeks, a routine developed. The same crews returned to the same farms. Farmers learned prisoners' names. Small conversations developed, limited by language but enriched by shared work. When Private Tanaka slipped from a ladder and twisted his ankle, Sullivan drove him personally to the camp infirmary, rather than waiting for the guards to radio for transport. Inside the camp, a different transformation was unfolding. Education classes started in January of 1944. American volunteers from nearby Medford and Ashland came to teach English 3 evenings per week. Initially, attendance was sparse, fewer than 40 men among thousands. Learning the enemy's language felt like betrayal to many, but gradually, pragmatism won out. Men realized that understanding English meant understanding their circumstances better, communicating needs to guards and administrators. By spring, the classes had 300 regular students. Corporal Masao Fujita, a former schoolteacher from Yokohama, organized the class schedules and assisted the American instructors. A quiet man of 38 who wore wire-rimmed glasses and maintained precise posture, Fujita approached language learning with systematic intensity. The American instructor, retired Professor Ellen Richardson, was a widow whose husband had taught history at the University of Oregon before his death in 1941. She volunteered at Camp White partly from loneliness, partly from curiosity about these enemy soldiers everyone discussed, but few actually knew. Her first evening teaching proved challenging. The men were polite but distant, mechanically repeating phrases without engagement. On her 3rd week, Richardson tried a different approach. She brought in photographs of Oregon, Crater Lake, the Columbia River Gorge, the Pacific coastline, the high desert. "This is where you are now," she told them through the translator. "This is Oregon. These are places some of you might see someday." The response surprised her. Men who had been stoic suddenly leaned forward, studying the images with intense interest. Questions emerged. "What are those mountains called? How far to the ocean?" Fujita raised his hand tentatively. "In my home," he said in halting English, "we have lake also. Sacred mountain. Very beautiful, like this picture." "Tell me about it," Richardson encouraged. What followed was a stumbling description of Mount Fuji and Lake Kawaguchi that nevertheless communicated profound homesickness. Other men began sharing too, about fishing villages, rice paddies, city streets, mountain shrines. Richardson listened, and in listening granted them something they hadn't experienced since capture, the acknowledgement that they had come from somewhere, that they had lives and memories that mattered. The camp library expanded. Red Cross packages arrived with increasing regularity. A baseball diamond was constructed, and weekend games became major events. Teams formed, rivalries developed, and guards sometimes joined in the games. The absurdity was not lost on anyone. Yesterday's enemies playing America's pastime in the Oregon scrubland. Yet beneath the surface normalcy, complex undercurrents flowed. Not all prisoners accepted the changing dynamic. A hardcore group of approximately 200 men maintained strict military discipline and refused cooperation with Americans. They saw the work programs and education classes as corruption, the friendliness with farmers as collaboration. Their leader had been a career officer, educated at the Naval Academy in Tokyo. His world was built on rigid hierarchies and absolute loyalty. He organized his faction to maintain traditional observances, refused to learn English, and sent contemptuous glares at prisoners who did. The split created tension within the barracks. Yamamoto found himself torn. His upbringing taught respect for authority and military structure, yet his daily experiences contradicted everything he'd been told about Americans. Sullivan treated him with rough fairness. Martha's kindness was genuine. The guards were professional, sometimes even friendly. One evening in June of 1944, the conflict came to a head. Tanaka, whose English had improved significantly, was discovered reading an American magazine. The hardline group confronted him in the barracks after lights out. "You disgrace yourself," their leader hissed in Japanese. "Reading their propaganda, learning their language, smiling at their women, you forget who you are." Tanaka, who had once wanted to die rather than live with the shame of capture, found unexpected courage. "I remember exactly who I am. I'm a man who is still alive. I choose to understand the world I'm living in rather than hiding from it. You choose collaboration over honor. I choose reality over fantasy. The war goes on without us. We're here. This is our situation. Making it more bearable isn't betrayal, it's survival." Yamamoto, listening from his bunk, felt the truth of Tanaka's words. Yet speaking up meant openly breaking from authority. The silence stretched. Finally, Fujita's voice came from the darkness. "The war taught us that death was the highest honor, but perhaps life requires a different kind of courage." Others murmured agreement. The hardline leader stormed out, his faction following. From that night forward, the camp was effectively divided. Summer brought intensive agricultural work. Prisoners harvested strawberries, beans, corn, and wheat across southern Oregon. The program expanded to include timber work and road maintenance. Some men sent money back to their families through the Red Cross, tiny amounts that nevertheless represented connection to the lives they'd left behind. Sullivan's relationship with his prisoner crew deepened through shared labor and the small intimacies of routine. He learned that Yamamoto had a wife and daughter he hadn't seen in 4 years, that Sato wanted to be an engineer, that Tanaka wrote poetry in his spare time. They learned that Sullivan worried constantly about his sons, that he was struggling to keep the farm profitable, that he'd been married to Martha for 32 years. One afternoon in August, news reached the camp that Allied forces had taken Saipan, then Guam, then the Philippines. The implications were clear. Japan was losing the war. The response among prisoners was complex. Some felt despair, others relief, many a confusing mixture of both. Yamamoto found himself hoping the war would end soon, then felt guilt for that hope. What kind of soldier hoped for his country's defeat? Yet what was the alternative? The tension increased when news filtered through in July of 1945 about devastating new weapons used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The details were unclear, but the scale was unprecedented. Then, on August 15th, the announcement: Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The camp descended into chaos of emotion. Some men wept openly, others sat in stunned silence. The hardline faction locked themselves in their barracks, refusing to believe the news was real. The majority simply didn't know how to feel. Relief? Shame? Loss? Hope? Lieutenant Colonel Brubaker called an assembly for the following morning. Standing before thousands of men whose status had just shifted from enemy combatants to former enemy combatants, he outlined the repatriation process. Ships would be arranged. All prisoners would return to Japan. The timeline was uncertain, possibly months, but the destination was assured. "You'll be going home," Brubaker concluded. "Back to your families, your lives, your country." The response was not what he expected. Instead of jubilation, he saw fear. Over the following days, an unprecedented situation developed. Prisoners began approaching administrators, requesting to delay their return. Some wanted to finish the harvest season, honoring commitments to farmers who depended on their labor. Others asked about staying longer to complete English courses or vocational training programs. A few made even more extraordinary requests. Could they possibly remain in America permanently? Sullivan was in his barn when Yamamoto approached him one evening in late August. The prisoner had been working at the orchard for nearly 2 years, and Sullivan had come to rely on his knowledge and steady temperament. "I need to speak with you," Yamamoto said in careful English, "about my future." Sullivan set down the tool he'd been repairing. "You'll be shipping out soon, I expect. Back to Japan." "Yes, this is what I must speak about." Yamamoto paused, clearly struggling with how to express something complex. "My village, Niigata, was manufacturing center, factories, machines. American bombers have targeted industrial cities heavily. I do not know if my home still exists. I do not know if my family survives." Sullivan felt the weight of those words. His own sons had participated in some of those bombing campaigns. Yamamoto continued, "If I return and they are gone, I have nothing. If they survive, the country will be devastated. No food, no work, no future. I have learned farming here, good farming, American methods. I have learned English. I have saved small money from work." He met Sullivan's eyes directly. "Is there any way I might stay? To work? To build new life?" Sullivan was stunned. "You want to stay in America? After everything?" "Because of everything," Yamamoto replied quietly. "Here I have found something I did not expect. Fairness, dignity, possibility, the chance to be more than what I was." Sullivan had no answer. The request was so far beyond anything he'd imagined that he couldn't process it. "I'll ask around," he finally said. "I don't know if it's even possible, but I'll ask." Similar conversations were happening across the valley. Farmer after farmer heard the same requests from prisoners they'd come to know as workers, and improbably as something approaching friends. The local newspaper, the Medford Mail Tribune, ran a story that caught regional attention. Japanese POWs request to stay in Oregon. The response was explosive. Letters to the editor ran 10-1 against the idea. Veterans groups expressed outrage. Politicians saw political opportunity in opposing it. But other voices emerged too. The local Farm Bureau issued a statement supporting consideration of the requests, noting the critical agricultural labor shortage. Church groups argued for compassion and Christian charity. Ellen Richardson wrote a passionate editorial, describing the transformation she'd witnessed in the education classes. The debate reached the Oregon state government, then the War Department in Washington. Officials were genuinely uncertain how to proceed. Immigration law was clear. Enemy aliens couldn't simply remain after a war. But these weren't exactly immigrants. They were prisoners who had lived under American supervision for years, who had worked honestly, who had broken no laws. In September, a team of military officials and immigration attorneys arrived at Camp White to assess the situation. They conducted interviews with prisoners who wanted to stay. The numbers surprised everyone. Nearly 2,100 men out of 3,200 expressed interest in remaining in America, at least temporarily, with 743 making formal requests for permanent immigration. Major Elizabeth Hawkins, an Army attorney assigned to review the cases, interviewed Yamamoto on September 20th. A no-nonsense Boston native with a law degree from Radcliffe, Hawkins had little sympathy for what she initially viewed as opportunism. "Why should America allow former enemy soldiers to remain here?" she asked directly. Yamamoto had prepared for this question. "Because America is supposed to be about possibility, yes? About people coming to build new lives? I have seen this here, in Oregon. People from many places, working together. I want to be part of this." "You fought against this country?" "Yes, I was soldier. Followed orders, served my country as I understood duty." But war is over. That soldier no longer exists. The man sitting here has worked hard, learned new skills, caused no trouble, and wishes only for chance at peaceful life. Hawkins made notes, her expression unreadable. You understand that Japan is devastated, that your country needs all its citizens to rebuild. I understand this deeply, it troubles me, but I also understand that if I return to nothing, I help no one. If I stay here, work, send money to family, if they survive, perhaps I help more. The logic was sound, but Hawkins knew it would be politically toxic. She interviewed dozens more men, hearing variations on the same themes, uncertainty about what they'd return to, appreciation for treatment they'd received, desire for opportunity, and perhaps, most importantly, a profound identity shift. Tanaka expressed it most clearly. I am no longer the boy who went to war. I am not fully American, but I am also no longer fully Japanese in the way I was. I exist in between, and that space is where I want to build my life. The review team's report, submitted in October, acknowledged the unprecedented nature of the situation. They recommended a limited program, allowing prisoners with sponsorship from American employers to apply for temporary work permits, while permanent immigration status was considered through normal channels. The recommendation landed in Washington like a grenade. Anti-immigration groups rallied against it. Veterans organizations sent delegations to Congress. The debate made national headlines. One representative gave an impassioned speech opposing any such program. These men wore the uniform of tyranny. They served an empire that attacked us without warning. To allow them to remain on American soil is an insult to every family who lost a son in the Pacific. But another representative offered a different perspective. I've met some of these men. I've talked to the farmers they worked for. They're not monsters. They're human beings who got caught up in their country's war just like our boys did. The war's over. We won. Can't we afford to show some magnanimity? The debate raged through November and December of 1945. Meanwhile, at Camp White, the repatriation process began. Ships were scheduled. Men were processed. Those in the hardline faction, who had refused all cooperation with Americans, were among the first to leave. They departed with rigid military bearing, showing no emotion. Yamamoto watched them go, feeling oddly hollow. He respected their certainty, even as he no longer shared it. His own application for a work permit was pending, sponsored by Sullivan, but the outcome remained uncertain. On January 3, 1946, the decision came down from Washington. A limited program would be established. Prisoners with legitimate job offers, clean disciplinary records, and sponsorship from American citizens could apply for one-year work permits. After that year, they could petition for permanent residency through standard immigration procedures. The program would accept a maximum of 500 applications. 743 men had applied. The selection process would be competitive, based on skills, employment prospects, and community support. Yamamoto's application was strong. Sullivan's sponsorship was detailed and heartfelt. His agricultural skills were documented, and his conduct record was spotless. On February 11th, he received notification. Accepted. The work permit would be valid for 1 year starting March 1st. He could remain in America. The emotion that washed over him was complex beyond description. Joy mixed with guilt, relief tangled with anxiety, hope shadowed by grief for the life and family he was leaving behind. He sat on his bunk holding the letter, and tears came. The first he'd allowed since capture nearly 3 years ago. Not everyone was so fortunate. Tanaka's application was rejected. His sponsor wasn't considered to offer employment sufficiently critical. Fujita, the schoolteacher, was accepted based on sponsorship from the University of Oregon's language department. Sato, the aspiring engineer, was rejected. The divisions were painful. Friends who had survived capture and imprisonment together would now be separated, possibly forever. On March 15, 1946, the last transport ship left with repatriated prisoners. Yamamoto stood outside the wire watching it go, his work permit papers in his pocket. 483 men had been accepted to the program. The camp officially closed on March 20th. The remaining Japanese men were transferred to civilian status and released to their sponsors. Yamamoto rode in Sullivan's truck to the farm, his few possessions in a small bag. "You'll stay in the apartment over the barn," Sullivan told him. "It's not fancy, but it's warm and dry. We'll work out a proper wage now that you're civilian." "You'll eat with us," Martha insists. Yamamoto nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. His first morning as a free man, he woke before dawn, as always, but there was no formation to attend, no guard count, no wire fence. He walked out into the orchard as the sun rose, touching the rough bark of apple trees he'd tended for 2 years. The air smelled of early spring, of soil and possibility. The transition was not easy. Hostility remained strong in many quarters. Signs in some Medford businesses read, "No Japs served." Yamamoto learned to avoid certain establishments, to keep his head down, to speak softly. But Sullivan stood by him, as did Martha and a growing network of farmers who valued his work. In May, word reached him through the Red Cross. His wife and daughter had survived. They were alive in Niigata, living in his brother's undamaged house. The city's industrial district had been heavily bombed, but the residential areas had been largely spared. The relief was so intense, he had to sit down. He began sending money home immediately, small amounts that nevertheless meant a great deal given Japan's post-war scarcity. His letters described his situation carefully, explaining his decision to stay temporarily, framing it as economic necessity rather than choice. The 1-year work permits became 2 years, then 3. The process for permanent residency proved complex and slow, tangled in bureaucracy and political resistance. Some men gave up and returned to Japan. Others, like Yamamoto, persisted. Ellen Richardson's English classes continued in Medford, now attended by the former prisoners as free men. She added citizenship preparation to the curriculum for those pursuing permanent status. The classes met in a church basement, and sometimes hostile groups would gather outside, shouting insults. Richardson would simply close the windows and continue teaching. Fujita thrived at the university. His precise teaching methods and deep knowledge of Japanese language and culture, making him a valuable resource as America began the occupation of Japan. He faced discrimination too, but found allies among faculty members who valued intellectual merit. Sullivan's farm prospered with Yamamoto's help. They expanded the orchard, modernized equipment, and increased production. Martha treated Yamamoto like family, insisting he join them for holidays, teaching him about American customs and fiercely defending him against any criticism. In 1949, Congress passed legislation simplifying naturalization for former Japanese prisoners who had remained in America under the work permit program. The political climate had shifted slightly. The Cold War was beginning. Japan was now an ally, and the men who had stayed had proven themselves through years of honest work. Yamamoto filed his naturalization application in August of that year. The interview took place in Portland, conducted by an immigration officer who seemed skeptical but fair. "Why do you want to become an American citizen?" Yamamoto had thought about this question for 5 years. "Because America gave me something I did not expect, the chance to be judged by my actions rather than my origins. I want to be part of a country that believes in that possibility." On December 7, 1949, 8 years to the day after the attack that had started the war, Yamamoto took the oath of citizenship. The irony of the date was not lost on him or anyone else present. Sullivan and Martha attended the ceremony, Martha crying openly when Yamamoto received his certificate. He was no longer Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto. He was Takeshi Yamamoto, American citizen, farmer, immigrant, survivor. His wife and daughter joined him in 1951, immigrating legally under family reunification provisions. The reunion was bittersweet. They had become strangers who shared a past, but not the intervening years. His daughter, now 12, barely remembered him. His wife struggled with the language and the isolation. But they built a life. Slowly, painfully, with setbacks and difficulties, they built something new. Yamamoto eventually purchased his own small farm. His daughter graduated from high school, then college, the first in their family line to do so. She became a teacher, married, and gave Yamamoto grandchildren who knew nothing of war or shame or barbed wire. Of the 483 men who had stayed initially, 321 eventually became American citizens. The others returned to Japan at various points, finding that the economic recovery there eventually offered opportunities too. Fujita remained at the University of Oregon for 33 years, eventually becoming department chair. Tanaka, who had been rejected from the work permit program, returned to Japan and became a successful businessman. He visited Oregon twice in his lifetime, meeting with Yamamoto and marveling at the life his friend had built. Sullivan ran his orchard until his death in 1971. Yamamoto was a pallbearer at the funeral. Martha lived another 12 years. She left Yamamoto a small inheritance in her will with a note, "For the friend who helped us save the farm and taught us that enemies can become family." The story of the Japanese prisoners who stayed became a footnote in Oregon history, occasionally mentioned in local histories, but never achieving widespread recognition. There were no monuments, no official commemorations. The men themselves generally preferred obscurity. But in small ways the legacy persisted. Family farms passed down through generations. University programs enriched by perspectives that bridged two cultures. Communities quietly integrated with families whose presence testified to the possibility of transformation. In 1995, the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a small ceremony was held in Medford to remember Camp White. About 30 people attended, including several former prisoners who had stayed, their children and grandchildren. A plaque was placed in a small park. Yamamoto, then 82 years old, spoke briefly at the ceremony. His English was still accented but fluent. "This place changed my life," he said simply. "I came here as enemy. I leave this world as American. In between I learned that people are complicated, that goodness exists in unexpected places, and that home is not always where you were born. Thank you to those who gave second chances." He died 3 months later, peacefully in his sleep. He was buried in the Medford Cemetery, not far from Sullivan and Martha. His gravestone lists his name, his birth and death years, and a single line: "Farmer, father, friend, American." The story of what happened when Japanese prisoners of war begged to stay in America after the war ended is ultimately a story about the spaces between certainties, about how treating people with basic dignity can transform both the treated and the treater, about courage that looks nothing like the battlefield kind, but might be more important. America's response surprised everyone because it revealed something essential, not the political rhetoric or the grand pronouncements, but the daily practice of ordinary people making room for others, even when those others had recently been enemies. It was messy, imperfect, contested, and incomplete, but it was also real. The men who stayed carried dual identities for the rest of their lives, never fully shedding the culture they came from, never fully integrated into the culture they joined. They existed in between, and in that liminal space they proved that belonging is not about erasure, but about addition, about becoming something new while honoring what you were. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.